Hello, everyone. My name is Mina Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and the Director of the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency in the Peter S. Kalikow School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs at Hofstra University. I am delighted to welcome everyone here today for a most timely discussion of national security challenges in 2022 and beyond. We have four speakers from the Army War College as part of the Eisenhower College Program series, which is a long-standing program to bridge information from the Army War College located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, with college programs across the country on key current national security and defense issues. And I am especially appreciative, not only to our speakers at the Army War College, whom my colleague Dr. Paul Fritz will introduce in a moment, but also to Dr. Fritz himself for initiating this bringing this program to Hofstra for the first time in 2020. Now, this is our third iteration, and I must tell you, all three have been on Zoom. We are most keen to bring our Army War College speakers to our campus. May 2023 be the year for that, but we are fortunate that Zoom has allowed us to continue to have these important conversations. And my deepest thanks to Dr. Fritz, to our speakers in today's panel, and to the Army War College for the past 3 years working with us so closely to make these instructive discussions possible in the panel and subsequently in our classrooms and other discussions. I would also like to thank the Hofstra Cultural Center for coordinating all the specifics of this event, particularly on Zoom, which can be just as much work as hosting events on campus in person, as we've learned. And also thanks to the Department of Political Science for co-sponsoring this event, which is also co-sponsored with the Public Policy and Public Service Program at Hofstra and the Kalikow Center for Presidency Studies. Thanks also to the Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for making all of this, for making this event possible, which is our culminating event of the season of the semester, before we move into the fun of research papers and finals. So hopefully today's commentary will provide some insights that Professor Fritz's students and other students can incorporate into their end of term assignments. We are very glad that Professor Fritz's international politics class is with us today, as well as many other guests. So with that, I will turn the formal introductions over to my colleague. Thank you, Dr. Fritz.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Bose, for all of your support with this. It's a great program that we've had the past couple of years, and I'm so glad that we've continued the relationship with the Army War College to be able to do this, because this is such a unique event for students and for the Hofstra community to be able to talk to military professionals who we don't always get to speak to in this way. So just a little bit on what we're doing, and just to note on sort of the long history on the Eisenhower Series College Program. It dates back to 1969. And it was designed very much in 1969, we're at the height of the Vietnam War and student protest and protest around the country against the war. And my understanding of this, having done this for a while and talked to the past directors and others, this is what spurred the War College to do this, was to be able to create dialogue and discussion between military professionals and the larger public, so that there could be exchange of ideas, so there could be a greater understanding of how military professionals view the world and important national security issues and other sorts of issues. So, this is just a wonderful opportunity for us. And I want to thank the War College, and I want to thank in particular Colonel Trent Hutton, who I've worked with to coordinate on all of this. And, I appreciate his patience with the thousands of emails that I've sent him on different things. So, but I really appreciate it. And I believe Colonel Leon Markowski. I don't believe he's here with us today, but he's the director of the program at the War College. I'd also like to thank him. And I really want to thank and just quickly second all of the thanks for Hofstra institutions that helped with this too, especially the Cultural Center. It did so much work, so thank you. So today I want to introduce our guests who we're so lucky to have speaking on three really important different topics. We have, for the first time, since we participated, one of our participants is not from U.S. military services, but rather from India. That is Brigadier General Amit Talwar. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And he'll be speaking on the trap of the Indo-Pacific. Brigadier General Talwar has served in various command and staff assignments for over 30 years of service. He's a graduate of the Indian and Bangladesh staff colleges. In addition to 2 master's degrees, he holds a master's of management studies from Osmania University. And he's represented India in various meetings at UN headquarters in Geneva and participated in joint exercises in India and abroad. So deeply experienced and really looking forward to him speaking. We also have Lieutenant Colonel Robert Greener. I hope that I'm pronouncing that correct, Colonel. I'm sorry. If I'm not, please correct me. He's an Army strategist with 23 years of military service and numerous deployments. His most recent operational assignment was a lead planner for Resolute support mission in Afghanistan, where he led efforts for implementation of NATO's mission, as well as planning for the withdrawal of its forces. He previously served as an instructor of national security at the U.S. Army War College, as lead planner for irregular warfare at Army headquarters in the Pentagon, as well as a policy analyst at the Department of State, and was the lead strategist for the Army Chief of Staff Personnel Management Task Force. Lieutenant Colonel Greener received his undergraduate degree from Ohio University, go Bobcats, and holds a master's degree from Yale University. So, and he will be speaking on lessons from Afghanistan, something I think that we were all very interested to hear about. And finally, our third speaker is Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Walsh. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh is a U.S. Army Reserve judge advocate and former federal prosecutor. As a judge advocate, Lieutenant Colonel Walsh has served as lead advisor to the military police unit in Iraq, an associate professor of national security law and criminal law, a military prosecutor, and a defense attorney. As a civilian, Mr. Walsh prosecuted federal crimes, including cyber intrusions, terrorism crimes with the terrorism crimes with the United States Attorney's Office. When he's not on military orders, he teaches law to federal agents at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And Lieutenant Colonel Walsh has a JD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and an LLM from the University of Virginia Law School, and is currently a student at the U.S. Army War College. So, and he'll be speaking about the red line when cyber activities become an act of war. So we have 3 very distinguished guests who's speaking on some very interesting, very topical, very important topics. One thing that I do want to say is that our guests are speaking from their personal point of view, is my understanding. None of the views expressed here are representative of official government statements, whether we're talking about the United States or India or anywhere else. That said, and with that in mind, though, what we're getting are military professionals' expertise and their analysis on these important issues. And going back to the opening of the purpose of this series, it's to engage dialogue. So in past years, and I expect this year, there'll be a lot of questions, there'll be a lot of frank exchanges, and that's the very best part of this. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I want to turn it over to Colonel Hutton now to sort of get the ball rolling. And I just went in alphabetical order in terms of the introduction of the guest. So however you want to proceed from here, please feel free to do so, and welcome again. So.
Thank you, Professor Fritz, and also to Professor Bose and the greater Hofstra University community for that great introduction, that warm introduction, and for hosting us this year again. Been great hosts in the past, and we do hope to be able to do this in person in the very near future. So we're really hoping for next year. Terrific introduction. You've carried the water, so I am going to hand it off to my colleagues. I will go in a different order than introduced. I think we'll have Lieutenant Colonel Pat Walsh go first, followed by Brigadier General Talwar, and then Lieutenant Colonel Griner. Go Bobcats. So good on you for that one. All right, so thank you very much, and I'll hand it over at this point to Lieutenant Colonel Walsh for his speech. Take it away.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. I'm excited to be here and talk to you, particularly to an international politics class, because I think my topic fits right in your wheelhouse. So what I want to talk about is how international law applies to cyber attacks. And in my background as a federal prosecutor, I dealt with cyber intrusions, which often, which is a crime, and prosecuting people like who are our adversaries on the international stage, Russians and North Koreans and Chinese. And then as a reservist, I put on a military uniform, and the Army borrows me for, one weekend or 1 year or several years. And I deal with cyber attacks in a different realm. Attack on the military side means something very, very different than a cyber attack on the civilian side. And so the interest to me is, where is the line between cyber crime and cyber war, a cyber attack? And so that's the issue. When does a cyber attack start a war? We know when a conventional attack starts a war. We have a good idea under international law when violence or armies or airplanes begin the process of a war. We saw it very clearly in the Ukraine conflict. But there is insufficient law, and there's been insufficient effort to develop a law for when a cyber attack can start a war, for when a cyber attack can trigger an armed conflict. And we really need to have this definition. We need a clear definition or a clear framework of when a cyber attack can trigger a war. And so that's the topic I want to talk to you about. And not just the United States needs it, but the United States needs to broadcast it to the world and get international consensus so the world has a clear definition, so everyone, adversaries and allies alike, know when a cyber attack can trigger an armed conflict. So let me talk about some definitions first. What do I mean by cyber attack, right? Again, attack under the military means a very significant thing, but when you and I use the phrase cyber attack, it could be a very broad definition of what can trigger or what that means. It can be someone stealing your data or your Netflix password, right? It can be ransomware that locks your computer, and it can go all the way to the extreme where it can cause real world damage in the community. It can cause a nuclear facility to be damaged. It can cause a dam to fail. And so what level of cyber attack could trigger a war? Clearly, it's only the most significant attacks, cyber attacks. In Article 2.4, and in Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, every nation agrees to not use force or threaten to use force against any other nation. They respect the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of any nation. Every nation who joins the UN, including Russia, has to make that promise not to use force against other nations. The Charter also acknowledges a right. And Article 51 of the UN Charter says every state has an inherent right of self-defense if they're a victim of an armed attack. And so that phrase armed attack is really what's at issue here, is when is a cyber attack an armed attack? And this definition really matters because we know from court opinions from the International Court of Justice and state practice that if a state is a victim of an armed attack, if a nation is a victim of an armed attack, that they can respond with force to defend against that armed attack. And the important thing is they don't have to respond with the exact same force that attacked them. And so if a cyber attack is an armed attack, then a state can respond not just in cyberspace, but in the real world. If a cyber attack is an armed attack, then a state can respond with conventional forces. They can send the armies and the Air Force and the Navy. They can drop the bombs and the missiles and send the soldiers in response to a cyber attack that rises to a level of an armed attack. So a cyber attack that is significant can cause a real world war. And yet we do not have a clear definition of where that red line is, where cyber crime becomes an act of war. So, and it's not like we're starting from scratch here. There has been some efforts in the international community to come to a definition of when a cyber attack can be an armed attack. So this whole area on how international law applies to cyberspace is still relatively new, given how long international law has been around. But the first effort to try to really apply what happens in cyberspace to international law, to the law of war, or international humanitarian law, was done by a group of international law experts, not by any one nation, but a group of experts from all over the world came together and developed the Tallinn Manual. It's named after a city in Estonia, which was one of the first major victims of a major cyber attack. And so they, in honor of that city, they named the manual after them. And they, in part of that manual, tried to define when a cyber attack could become an armed attack. And their first effort, which was in 2013, said that a cyber attack can be an armed attack if its scale and effects equal a conventional attack, which was a good start, but not enough, because yeah, it makes sense that if a cyber attack causes damage on the ground the same as dropping bombs or missiles, then of course that would apply. But you and I can think of all kinds of other ways that someone can conduct a cyber attack that can cause huge amounts of harm without causing explosions. And so they needed to do more. And that was 2013. In 2015, the United States stepped forward. They developed the Law of War Manual. The Department of Defense issued its own manual on what it believes was the law that applies to the US military during wartime. And a very small part of that talked about cyber attacks. And they, similar, but with a little different language, they agreed with the Tallinn Manual, saying that the effects of a cyber attack can determine whether it is an armed attack. But then they added this sentence, and you can see if this is a clear red line. They said, the Department of Defense said, other factors may also be relevant. So effects matter, other factors may also be relevant. So not a very clear line. A year later in 2016, the Department of State, their top lawyer, the legal advisor, Brian Egan, gave a speech that was supposed to discuss US policy, and he addressed that issue. And he gave a definition for when a cyber attack can be an armed attack that was similar but different than both the Tallinn Manual and the Law of War Manual. And the Department of State's definition said there were two factors. One is whether the effects of the cyber attack are kinetic or non-kinetic, meaning kinetic meaning something blows up, has real world effects. Non-kinetic means its effects are only in cyberspace. And the second is whether the cyber attack's connected to an armed conflict. And so that second factor isn't in any of the others. That was in 2016. 3 starting efforts to come to a difficult thing for when cyber attack becomes an armed attack. But since 2016, the international community and the United States really haven't done a whole lot. And we've seen since 2016 a whole host of serious cyber attacks. Now we really need to come up with a concerted definition. We need to have a definition that is very clear for when a cyber attack moves from a crime to an act of war or that can trigger an armed conflict. We need to do that so the US can draw a red line, so the international community and our adversaries know of what line they should not cross or risk a response in self-defense from the US military. Now, the United States needs to take the lead and broadcast to the world what they believe their definition is and seek to get international consensus from the international community. It's time now to have a clear definition. It's really time to draw the red line on when a cyber attack can start a war. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you, Pat. And so what I think we should do is move on to the second speaker and get through the 3, and then we'll open it up to open Q&A where we can touch on all of these these subjects, as well as go beyond to any of the other current events that may be of interest to the crowd. Is that copacetic?
Sounds good. Thank you.
And then, so we'll have Brigadier General Talwar present his speech next.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody at Hofstra. I don't know if you can see me, but we are at a device where, I don't know, I'll have to shift a little. Yeah, you can see us?
It'll catch up here.
Yeah, okay. So,
Yes, thank you.
okay, good afternoon. Thanks a lot for having me over. You know, it's a privilege for me to actually be speaking to you all, and thank you for your time. I'm going to be talking about a current topic, which is it's actually been taken from the Indo-US or the, recently published strategy, which is the Indo-Pacific strategy of 2022, which just came out in February this year. And the topic that I was researching was that, is the Indo-Pacific a trap, and is it becoming a trap? So I will basically cover my topic in 4 parts. In part 1, I want to basically define what is the Indo-Pacific. And when we were doing this in person, I used to actually take people on a plane ride, but I'll try and do this in the virtual setting too. So imagine you are sitting in San Diego or San Francisco airport, and you start taking a flight all the way across, which crosses over Hawaii, then crosses over Japan, then crosses over Korea, goes all across and lands in the beautiful Thailand. And if you were to take that expanse, and by the way, it's about an 18-hour flight that you just took, is actually just the Pacific Ocean. If you want to understand the Indian Ocean, you have to take another flight that is now going to start you off from Thailand, cross all across Myanmar, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, go across right till the Horn of Africa. And that is the Indian Ocean. And so if you were to now look at this entire expanse that I've spoken about is the Indo-Pacific. It's a huge area, right? And if it is a huge area, it covers roughly about 2/3 of everything in the globe. 60% of the population, 2/3 of the GDPs, 2/3 of the economies. It is the manufacturing hub of the globe. All supply chains are connected to it. And everything in the Indo-Pacific, in my research, what it showed was actually about trade. And what is happening over a period of time, if I've defined the Indo-Pacific correctly, I will now try and define why is the Indo-Pacific strategically so important. Well, if you look at the United States, it is the ASEAN nations and the area of the Pacific is actually the #1 destination for all foreign direct investment that is done by the US. So it's a two-way street. $1.75 trillion in 2020 went into that area. And whatever gets spent there actually comes back to continental United States. Then whatever is happening in the Indian Ocean is all the trade routes, which are oil, gas, minerals, rare earth elements, which are actually transiting from Africa all the way across to maybe China or other nations in that area. So the strategic importance of this area is immense. Now, great power competition, which has started off between the United States and China, which is a recent, I would say, a decade-old phenomena, has turned the element of trade actually into a little bit of a competition. And the problem is that smaller nations or nations which are weaker are now feeling a little bind. Now, how are they feeling this bind? Imagine if you are part of the ASEAN nations, every nation needs to trade with China. So while trade is the driving force, it is their security because of Chinese coercion over a period of time due to the Belt and Road Initiative and the other coercive mechanisms of economic drives that are now making these nations insecure. If China is the coercive power, whom do they look to for security? It's naturally the West. And in the West, it is the United States. So there is this tension between trade or the requirement to do trade with China, but at the same point in time, look to a different partner for security. And this is this competition between trade and security, which is making it a trap. Now, if this is a trap, what do we do about it? I would say great power competition has been held or has been dealt with very responsibly by both the nations. If you look at it, I think the United States has not really increased militarization of the Indo-Pacific. The bases still remain in the traditional deployment areas of Korea, Japan, Hawaii, Guam. Nothing is moving down into the Indian Ocean. And on the part of China, if you see, there is an accommodation also for the smaller nations. And as long as this dynamic of a balance between trade and security continues, I think we will have a zone of no war, no peace. However, this region has huge, I would say, potential for other cooperations. Vaccines, you have 5G, you have the availability of providing better healthcare, better services to these nations which are now developing and coming out on their own. So that in broad is the gist of my talk, and I'm happy to take on any questions that you have related to this or anything in the region that I could further elucidate on. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigadier General Towler. And now, and not last but not least, we'll listen to Lieutenant Colonel Rob Greiner speak about his thoughts on Afghanistan.
Thank you. And I appreciate all of the Ohio University charity that we received this morning. That's fantastic. Go Bob. I believe maybe so. It's all right. I just like to remind all the Ohio State Buckeyes like to remind that OU was the first university in the Northwest Territory. Maybe not the best anymore, but certainly have a good Halloween party. Yeah, as my introduction alluded to, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Rob Greiner, and I have been a soldier in the Army for 23 years, since I was 17 years old. What was not mentioned is that I'm a husband for the last 15 years, and I'm the father of 5 children, and my oldest being 13 years old. The only reason I mentioned that is to say, I've been married 15 years and my kids are 13 years old. I feel like that's a very long time. That is a stretch of my life. But longer than that is the amount of time that I have invested professionally and personally in America's wars on terrorism in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So as a soldier for 23 years, all but 3 of those years were spent looking at this particular problem set. And that's a very, very long time to spend focused on anything, let alone something as complex and that requires so much as the wars on terror. While I've been here at the Army War College, I've had the great luxury to be able to unpack a lot of what I have invested myself into over these last 23 years. And particularly what I wanted to look into were the messy circumstances of the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan that we witnessed in the news last year. And I wanted to understand what happened. How could America's investment in this nation, this 20-year investment, have ended the way that it did? Now, in the study of war, we rely heavily on a Prussian military theorist named Karl von Clausewitz. And Karl von Clausewitz postulates that the attributes of a given war, the character of that war, are really shaped by the manner in which a nation balances the interplay of 3 elements: the government, the military, and society. Okay, now I don't want to bore you with theory, but this is an IR class, I believe, so you guys are steeped in theory. And I shouldn't have to tell you the importance of theory. As an IR guy myself and as a military strategist, we use it all the time. But theory really helps us take these multifaceted problems. And war is probably the most complex of human endeavors, right? And by looking at these complex issues through the lens of theory, we can decompose the problem, right? We can form a basis of evaluation to better understand the problem. And so that's what I did with Clausewitz's Trinity. And what I'd offer to you is that as applied to Afghanistan, there were characteristics among each of those 3 vertexes, the government, the military, and society, that proved terminal to the outcome in Afghanistan. And although it may not have been preventable, I'm not trying to go back in time and say we should have changed these things. What I would offer to you is that the outcome should have been entirely foreseeable based on Clausewitz's theory. And I'll try to extrapolate some of those for you here very briefly. Looking at the first vertice, the government. Clausewitz says, no one starts a war, at least no one in his senses ought to do so, without first being clear in his mind what he hopes to achieve by that war and how he intends to conduct it. Okay, now, national security, which is the apex of strategy, always begins with an endpoint in mind. What is it we want to achieve? What is the condition? What is the change in the environment? What is the political objective that we are seeking to achieve as a nation, so that the military can then define a strategy to pursue those objectives? In the case of Afghanistan, that end state was wanting. We went into Afghanistan to exercise our national power. Right? We, and rightfully so, had just been attacked on 9/11, and we needed to hold accountable those culpable for 9/11. That's both on the terrorist side, Al-Qaeda, as well as the Afghan government at the time, the Taliban, who were providing safe haven and refuge to Al-Qaeda. Because we didn't have an endpoint in mind, and maybe Yogi Berra actually sums it up best, if you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else. I think that applied to Afghanistan. When you decouple strategy from this political objective, from this clear statement of what we want to achieve in the environment, the strategy, the mission itself can transmute, right? It can permutate into something that you didn't start off intending. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. As I mentioned, we went in for right and proper good reasons, right? Exercising our national power. We ended up staying, exercising our national ideals. Right? The mission evolved from one targeting the terrorists of 9/11 to one of building a nation. Right? And not just any nation, but a nation as mature as our own nation. We wanted to see a centralized government. Right? We wanted to see a professional military. We wanted to see standards of education and gender equality, right? High and lofty ideals that, again, are good, but not the reason we went into Afghanistan. Second verdicts, the military. There were three things that my analysis indicates perhaps led to the strategic character that we witnessed towards the end of the war in Afghanistan, vis-a-vis the military domain. Expectation setting, competing priorities, and overconfidence. Now, very briefly, expectation setting. When the mission evolved from one very focused counterterrorism mission to one that essentially was rebuilding a nation, the military needed to do a reassessment to say, okay, you put us here for this reason, now we're trying to achieve this reason. It's going to require this change in resources, right? This much money, this many soldiers, probably this much time. Now, while the military may have conducted that reassessment, we failed to garner those resources from the government, right? To change their perspective and their mindset from how we went into Afghanistan to now what we need in order to execute the mission that we had been dealt. The second, competing priorities. It certainly did not help that in 2003, the nation went to war with Iraq as well. And Iraq overshadowed everything that was happening in Afghanistan. And sometimes that's required. When you have two priorities, you have to prioritize. You have people say, okay, we're going to focus our resources here. The problem manifests when that prioritization leads to neglect of one of the theaters of war. And that's what we saw with Afghanistan. The brain power and the military muscle was going to Iraq, and we kind of put it, assuming that while we fought in Iraq. And lastly, overconfidence. I believe the military hubris, our overconfidence and our ability to be optimistic, to be can-do achievers, perhaps overshadowed our ability to discern real progress in Afghanistan. When I was in NATO, and I was the lead planner for all operations in Afghanistan for US and for NATO forces, twice a year, we would help the commander, who was an American commander in Afghanistan, prepare a report for policymakers of all the nations that had contributed soldiers. And in every report, we certainly brought up our concerns, what we saw as obstacles towards achieving our objective. But in every report that I was a part of and witnessed, we overbalanced those concerns with optimism. right? We said that we were what's what I'm looking for? I'm sorry. We were optimistic, cautiously optimistic. Thank you. Cautiously optimistic about the war in Afghanistan, and that we were rounding the corner. Now, how many times you can round a corner before you start back at the beginning became quite an acrimonious joke within NATO for the policymakers and the military alike. Now, lastly, the role of society. In a representative democracy such as our own, the role of society cannot be understated, right? The opinion of the public, which is typically demonstrated through the ballot box, has incredible sway in the calculus and formulation of policy. But we as Americans seldom leverage to full effect that ability. And I would offer to you two reasons for that. The first is foreign policy illiteracy. Ignorance, to be blunt, not in a bad way, ignorance, but ignorance is in, we just don't understand foreign policy as a nation. Now, why is that? We don't have a need to. There's no issue saliency there, right? Americans want to focus on domestic issues, issues that directly impact them at home, their families, their wallet, their livelihood, right? Foreign policy issues are just too far removed. I'd offer to you a survey in 2020, a representative survey where fewer than half of Americans could identify Afghanistan as the nation that had provided safe haven to Al-Qaeda. Now, this is despite nearly 20 years of being at war. So that was the first issue, foreign policy illiteracy. The second issue is disinterest, just genuine disinterest. Americans don't have a need to care about a war if they're not being inconvenienced by that war. Now, in the case of Afghanistan, the government made the opinion, much like in Vietnam, not to galvanize the passions of society. And they did this by withholding three tools, right? Debt, draft, and death. Okay, now I'm not saying that we need to have all three of these in unison. What I'm saying to you is that by inconveniencing the public through one of those three means, you can evoke the passions of the people and thereby the oversight of the public on the policymakers. Now, if we talk about debt, the war was expensive. Absolutely, cost $3.5 trillion by some estimates. But we paid for that war by charging it to Uncle Sam's credit card, right? The inconvenience of the cost of war did not impact the wallets of the public. We talk about draft. Well, we have an all-volunteer force since 1973. You have 0.3% of the American public that actually served in Afghanistan over the 23-year span of that war. The inconvenience of service was somebody else's to deal with, not the average Americans. And related to that, we have death. The war cost nearly 3,000 American service members, countless more from our allies and partners, as well as from Afghans themselves. But as I mentioned, when 0.3% served in Afghanistan, and at any given moment, only 0.5% of the nation is in uniform, death is not something that is at the doorstep of most Americans. So absent these, death, draft, and debt, the American public had no impetus to have interest in the war in Afghanistan. So I'll leave it there with the three vertexes of Clausewitz Trinity. Again, the government, the military, and society. And by looking at the three of those in aggregate, not holding one more culpable than any other, it shaped the strategic character of the war in Afghanistan and predisposed it to one that was going to face adversity and be prone to failure. And with that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to all three of my student panelists. And at this point, I would like to open it up to questions, whether that be via raised hands or if you'd like to enter one into the chat, we can take it from there.
Thank you to all of our speakers. I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Fritz in a moment. I just wanted to say that I've currently, the chat is currently disabled because we didn't want to interrupt the discussion. Dr. Fritz, do we want to start with a few questions and should I open up or whatever you'd like to do?
I've got a couple, well, I've got a million questions for our panelists because it's such a wonderful topic. So maybe I'll just ask a couple to get the ball rolling a little bit and then students jump in or Dr. Bose if you have some too. But I'll try to keep my questions quick in some ways so that we can just get the ball rolling in some ways, like I said. But I've got one for each of you. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, fascinating presentation on cyber. This is something I've been looking at for a while, especially in the context of deterrence in cyber warfare. And there's been a lot of good work on this kind of thing. And I think you're absolutely right that you need a definition of when cyber attacks go to cyber war to be able to do this. And I think you ended by really highlighting that in a sense of establishing deterrence or cyber attacks. And that's maybe one of the things that we need to do. My question is, though, deterrence in a traditional sense is very hard to implement. It's, as we, depending on how you view sort of the threat of sanctions against Russia as a deterrent to the before February 24th and the invasion of Russia. I mean, this is just one of the latest examples of people saying that sort of the threat of punishment doesn't necessarily stop actors, or you have to calculate in better ways to be able to do this. So I was just wondering if you could go on a little bit about the particular nature of cyber and what makes in this regard of deterrence, and what is different between the cyber realm and the conventional realm in that regard. So I can just leave it there and let Lieutenant Colonel Walsh answer, and then go for the others, or however you want to do it.
Go ahead. Yeah,
Go ahead.
great. That's a great question. I mean, I love one of the awesome things about researching in this area, as you know, is that it's relatively new, so there's all kinds of unresolved questions and things to work on. I think one of the reasons we need a clear law on this in cyberspace is because so many other parts of the issues in cyberspace are also so murky, right? And in conventional conflict, it's usually pretty straightforward who is attacking you, right? There could be little green men like there were in Crimea, but they're uncovered relatively straightforward. In cyberspace, figuring out who is attacking you has its own challenges. And learning, they use the word attribution. Who is the one? It's also very hard in cyberspace to understand really the effects of certain type of cyber attacks. We've seen cyber attacks that have spread vastly wider than I think the attacker originally intended. The NotPetya is one. And there are many others. And so understanding the significance or the effect of the cyber attack is also hard. And then if you put on top of that the fact that we don't have a clear legal answer for when cyber attack moves from crime or harassment, as some of the attacks on Ukraine were called, cyber harassment, to an act of war, is, just adds further confusion. Attribution is something that everyone is working on, and the military is getting quite better. Civilian experts are getting quite better on being able to figure out who is responsible for certain attacks, but that will always be a challenge. The type of attack and making it narrow or specific depends on the sophistication of the attacker, and that's something the U.S. can control for the United States, but can't control for the rest of the world. But the law is something that we can't control. And the law is something, international law is something that the United States has traditionally taken a lead role and pushed forward, even if we don't always join the treaties that we're pushing, forward, that we played a role in developing the international legal system, the rules-based international order that regulates the world right now. And so this is an area, I think, that we can have clear law. And then we'll struggle with whether deterrence, having that clear law, is deterrence effective. But that puts it in the same thing with conventional attacks. Deterrence it's always hard to tell if your deterrence got them to not do the thing that you were worried about them doing. And so that will still be a challenge. But this is, to me, setting up the law is the easiest of these multiple challenges in cyberspace to tackle. So let's figure that one out first, and then we can move on to the next challenge.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful answer to that really tricky question. Lots of students out there, there is a lot of room for research on this. So, because it's all fast moving.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
Dr. Bose.
Could we just ask just a quick follow-up, because I just think it's such an important topic, and there seems to be almost, I would say, some optimism about creating a law. And when we look at the difficulty of policymaking, both national and international, the barriers seem much higher than Colonel Walsh's presentation and comments suggest. And so I was just wondering if you could just follow up a little bit on how we get the law, how we get there.
Optimism on people following the law, or optimism on whether we can actually create such a law?
The latter, on creating the law.
So I am optimistic by nature, right? Because I'm hopeful that the world will continue with fits and turns to progress to be a better world, right? With less violence and conflict and more trade and equality. That's what I hope. But we can do this. And so under international law, let me back. How does international law get created? The easiest way, or the most clear way, is nations get together and form an agreement, a treaty, which is a contract that says, this is how we will operate going forward. We promise to follow the law. That's what the UN Charter is. The Rome Statute, which set up the International Criminal Court, that's a war crimes court. Their international human rights treaties are treaties on landmines, where we all agree, the nations that sign up agree this is how it will work. That's the most clear-cut way, but not the only way. There are other ways. One of them is called state practice. And if nations get together and act in a particular way for a period of time, and as if they believe that they're required to act in that way, suddenly that practice can become law. And so the combination of individual nations telling other nations that they believe they're legally obligated to act in a certain way, and acting consistent with what their words are, can start to push state practice forward. And the third way, and the least common, is international experts. The most famous of them was Grotius, but international experts can broadcast on what they think the law should be. And over time, that can help contribute to what the law is. And so there is something to be said for nations speaking out on what they think the law is and telling the world that they're going to act in accordance with it, because that over time, a significant amount of time, can set forward what the law is. So are we going to have a Geneva Convention on, what are cyber attacks, equal act of war? I don't know, but we need to start thinking about it, and individual states need to start taking steps of saying where they think it should be, and hopefully that we'll get there down the road at some point.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I have follow-ups, but I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Fritz. And I saw that a student had a question. And I just want to say, Kelly, I messaged you. As soon as we move to student questions, we'll come right back to this. But let's continue with Dr. Fritz's questions.
Okay, so thank you. Colonel Walsh, thank you for giving the first half of my lecture on Thursday on international laws when we do that, and that was a perfect, I don't think I can top that on Thursday. So, I want to ask General Tawar a question, because I think that perspective on the Indo-Pacific was really interesting. As I read the White House documents on the Indo-Pacific strategy, I see conflict much more sort of as sort of the model going forward. Not trying to stoke conflict, right, but emphasizing conflict, potential for conflict there. And you really focused much more on opportunities for cooperation. So I guess the question that I have is a model like the White House, the Biden White House, or even Obama did this to an extent, focusing on sort of the potential for conflict in the region. Is that the wrong approach? And should the balance be sort of shifted so that we're thinking more of those cooperative opportunities rather than the points of conflict that could come up within great power relations?
That's a great observation and a question, I must say. So let me put it to you in this fashion. Right through the last maybe about 2 or 3 administrations, and I speak only from my research. I'm not resident American. What my research showed was pretty much the same line when it came of policy when it came to China. And I think there is logic to that, because if you look at it from the perspective of the United States, the superpower status is being challenged. In fact, it is already being challenged when you come to the Indo-Pacific. Now, there are one of two ways that you could go about this competition. We also, I think, should be mindful of the fact that the very fact of where I explained the vastness of the Indo-Pacific and the reach that you would need in terms of military power is something which is of a question that I think we are still tackling with here. So I agree with your, if I was to say your supposition of my talk, to say that I think people are trying, or the policymakers are trying to keep military contest out of this competition. And I think the design of this strategy is good because it shows both sides that there is capacity to go to the next level if we want to. But I think the intent is to focus on deliverables which would I would say, bring down the possibility of militarization of this conflict. And that is not to say that either side is not prepared or preparing. I think there is enough evidence of that on both sides. So in my summation, I would say that I would hope pretty much like Pat, I'm an optimist too. I would pretty much hope for the sake of the larger nations in the Indo-Pacific, that the competition does not turn to conflict and remains in this zone, which is not really gray, but I think trade is the larger driving factor and not militarization. I hope I've given you some answer on that.
Matt,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That was a wonderful answer.
Dr. Fred, I just wanted to, and I love this brief, because as a military war planner, we tend to often think about conflict and not cooperation, right? And so we always go to the most dangerous scenario, even though we have planners and plans for cooperation. But your question kind of, is there room in the strategic framework to accommodate these notions of cooperation? I just wanted to touch on, because frameworks are so important, right? The national strategy and subsequent national defense strategy, it actually looks at this competition continuum, is what we call it, right? So it's not just black or white cooperation or conflict, right? It's this continuum, and you can operate anywhere on the spectrum. The whole thing is framed by conflict, by adversaries, by nations looking for strategic advantage, right? And so at the bottom, lower end of that, you've got cooperation, you've got competition below armed conflict, and then you have armed conflict. And the trick is having plans and strategies and opportunities that can move across that spectrum for all three of them. So going back, does strategy accommodate this? I think this nuanced and new approach that we've taken as a nation, and this isn't a new approach, actually accommodates it quite well.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'll just take 30 seconds more and to go on with what Rob is saying. If you look at the larger dynamic of what prevails in the international order, it is peace. And most people would say war is an error, actually. So strategies, I think, which are being designed, at least in the contemporary times, in my understanding, are actually being designed, how do we not commit that error? And if we were to look at it from that perspective, I think it's a damn good strategy.
Well, thank you both for explaining that, because I think that's really important to note, sort of that it's not just conflict or peace. There's different parts of this. Peace is most prevalent. Political scientist, famously Eric Gardsky, said war is in the error term, right? Because it's so, it doesn't occur very often, and we don't have a good systematic explanation for it for a lot of ways when it does occur. But the bigger point is that it's pretty rare, and stressing sort of the cooperative aspects of it might be really important. So thank you for that thoughtful answer, both of you. I have another question, but Dr. Bose, did you want to jump in too, or?
No, I'm going to let you go
Okay.
ahead, Dr. Fritz, and then
Okay.
we'll open it up for the students after that. So
That's good.
I'll defer to you.
Okay. All right. So, Colonel Greiner, I wanted to ask you, thank you. I wanted to thank you for bringing up Clausewitz. I don't talk about Clausewitz in this class, but I do in others. So I'll have to have you back for my technology and defense policy class at some point. But I think the theory that you put forward is very interesting, and focusing on sort of the debt, draft, and death as sort of the societal issues that we've wanted. The government wanted to avoid, that the public pays too much attention to this. And I want to put this in the context of sort of the withdrawal, because the public, at least initially, was very upset with how the withdrawal from Afghanistan went, because from the outside, it looked extremely chaotic. There were lots of allies on the ground that were seemingly left behind. Afghan allies in particular is what I mean, not NATO allies or others. And it looked terrible in a lot of ways. So the public reaction was pretty swift initially on this kind of stuff, but it's kind of faded in some ways. And it makes me wonder if there are, with sort of the ways that we've tried to not inconvenience the public with war, having taken that as a lesson from Vietnam and others, right? But also then seeing sort of the negative effects of it. Are we going to take is the public and our government officials, as well as military officials, going to take the right lessons, some of which you've pointed out from this experience in Afghanistan, in terms of having to get it right? Or are we going to just kind of forget about it all again, kind of like we did in Vietnam for a little bit afterwards, where we just kind of wanted to forget about some of the lessons of Vietnam? We had to rewrite the counterinsurgency manual, for example, and that kind of stuff. What are your thoughts on this? Because it's, what's most fresh in our minds, I guess, for a lot of people is that chaotic withdrawal from Kabul. So please, I go right ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And then that's really the meat of what compelled me to look into Afghanistan after having done this for so long. The last thing I wanted to think about during my year here in intellectual freedom land was more of war, but watching that unfold is what drove me to want to understand it myself. And I think unlike my colleagues here, I'm a Mearsheimer. I'm a realist. But you could say that society is fickle. If you want to talk Shakespeare, he uses other choice words as well. But really what we saw, the reaction, this visceral reaction during last summer, I'd offer to you was genuine, but really media drives society. The policy elites drive society. What's trending, what's tweeting drives society. And I'm not surprised, and I wish I would have made a bet somehow when I talked to my colleagues here, my seminar mates, and I said, just watch how quickly this fades from the radar of society. And sure enough, it certainly did. Will we learn the right lessons? In the long term, I got to say, I'm not optimistic. I'm not. This is a perennial issue for us. We think culturally very short term. And I mean, to go back to the previous point, we treat, war, it's either black or it's white, and war is a kind of an aberration, and we don't have to think about that. This is, again, the way I'm approaching it. And we fail to see that sometimes peace is about war. Peace is about setting conditions for war. But we put the blinders on and we say, we'll never do that again. We'll never be in a counterinsurgency again. We don't do nation building. Look what happened to Russia. We won't make those mistakes. Right, but we often fall prey to that, and I think it comes back to perhaps our hubris, comes back to victory disease, and so absent mechanisms, and I think we have to have forcing functions. And there's something called the Powell-Weinberger Doctrine, which General Powell implemented successfully in the 90s, really, and it's a litmus test before the commitment of force. It asks a series of questions. It poses, do we meet these criteria? And if so, then we should commit force. We should commit them without resolve. We should commit them to win. We should have a clear end state in mind, etc. And so I think you have to have this series of litmus tests. And we don't like to do that because they bind our options, right? They constrain policymakers occasionally. And I think, we have the finances. We're a wealthy nation. We've got the best military in the world, and we can do wars on the cheap. right? That's what makes America America. We can project power anywhere in the world, something that no other nation can do. Therefore, we can project our influence and we can project our preferences anywhere in the world. So we can do war on the cheap. And if society is not engaged through, again, the death draft or debt, that's an option Congress could make. Leveraging it's called authorizations for the use of military force, which is kind of a way of declaring war without formally declaring war, right? It gives the president the ability to use force, where Congress just has kind of a very tepid oversight function. And if we continue to use AUMFs and not evoke the passions of society, I'm afraid that we'll continue to stumble into this perennial problem of ours, which is doing war on the cheap.
Well,
I'm
thank
very
you.
optimistic. I know, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I'm positive, but
Well, as someone who studies U.S. foreign policy and decision making, I kind of share your pessimism there. But you did point out things that can be done, right? Congress can declare war. We can make it a societal wide thing. The draft could, I mean, I know the military doesn't want the draft, but the draft could be reinstated, you know, in a lot of ways. So there are options but I agree that they're probably not going to be taken anytime soon. So thank you for indulging my questions. I have others, but I want students to get to questions too. So please raise your hands. If you don't want to raise your hand, you can put a question into the chat. But I see a bunch of hands popping up first. And Kelly was initially had hers up earlier, and then I see Alyssa after that. So Kelly, please.
Oh, Dr. Fritz, before they begin, I just want to say I'm opening up the chat now too. So, but we do want to encourage students if they'll speak up. I think we have a kind of a nice setting here for them to speak directly, but I will open up the chat now as well.
Great, thank you. So Kelly, please go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to ask you to unmute. My fault.
Sorry about that. A little too eager. So I wanted to go back to actually your original question, Dr. Fritz, and return to Lieutenant Walsh. I'm very interested in international law and was wondering what sort of things we were looking to prohibit in international law regarding cyber attacks. Is there any instances that we could look at that we would want to ban, or is there any specifics, any consequences? Can you talk a little bit more on that?
Sure. And let me break that up into two parts. The part I was talking about is cyber attacks and when a cyber attack can start a war. There's a second part after that, and that's what cyber attacks are permissible when you have a war that's already started. So that as much, I'm a lawyer, but I don't like using Latin, which is weird, but they're two Latin phrases. Jus ad bellum, which is what the international law, humanitarian law, or the law of war that applies, and how wars start. And then jus in bello is the law that governs what happens during a war. So the second part we're getting better at, because it's really applying cyber attacks to the law that we already know. That's the things like the Geneva Conventions. There's a Geneva Conventions about how you take care of prisoners of war, and there's also conventions called the Hague Conventions and conventions on what type of attacks you can do. And so any cyber attacks have to comply with the laws of war. And I can talk about those more if you want to, but basically that you have to target any attack by the military has to be targeted against the enemy military. You're not supposed to target civilian populations. You're not supposed to target civilian property. And so taking out a dam that provides water to a city would be probably would be unlawful under the law of war, whether you did it by dropping bombs on it or by launching a cyber attack. There has to be a military reason, and it has to be against a military target as a general rule. There are all kinds of exceptions to it. And so even though we know what that law is, figuring out how cyber attacks fit into that, we're going to have to do over time as cyber attacks occur during armed conflicts. And so those have been happening. Unfortunately, they will likely continue to happen because cyber attacks as a tool can be an effective tool to help militaries during military engagements. during fighting. So how they start a war, though, is an area where we don't have yet and we need to develop. And as a lawyer, to me, it's more important that we have clear rules than exactly what the rules are. I may have particular things that I want that I think are a good idea, but I am not so arrogant to think that I know the right answer here. I think we need to figure out the right answer. But the next step would be, maybe if the United States wanted to take a lead in this, they could make some declaratory statements. They'd literally draw the line. If you do this, we think that is a cyber attack that equals an armed attack under the UN Charter and can start a war. And we could do that and then allow other nations to respond, either to agree or disagree. That would be one way to move the ball forward. We could convene meetings with our allies, NATO partners, partnered where other collective defense agreements, and say, hey, we have under NATO, as you've all learned watching Ukraine, that we have an obligation to defend NATO if they're attacked. Well, what if it's a cyber attack? We don't know when a cyber attack becomes that armed attack that would trigger our NATO defense response. So we could meet with our NATO partners and say, hey, for purposes of NATO, here's what we mean on when a cyber attack becomes an armed attack. And I think that's the next step. I don't know if that completely answered your question, Kelly. I hope so.
Thank you. That was great. Alyssa, you're next. So unmute.
Okay, great. No, thank you. Thank you for all of you being here today. I was actually excited to know that we were going to talk about a little bit about Indo-Pacific. I've been looking at the geopolitical situation happening in the South China Sea. So my question is to Brigadier Tawal. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. But from the situation, how do nations establish lines of demarcation of what their borders are in a civil manner, of course, via talks without military aggression that we've been seeing from China already?
So if I got your question right, what you're saying is, how do nations have political borders? Is that your question?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, so I'll try and frame it in the context of the United States. The United States actually is really privileged to be in a zone where you are protected by two seas on both sides, and you have Canada to the north and Mexico to the south, right? So you don't really have a concept of active, live, or contested borders. So if I were to take you to a region, let us take us to the Koreas, right? So you have North and South Koreas. It's an active border. The border itself has militaries deployed on both sides, and there is active military contest, which goes on, I would say, almost on a daily basis. So that would be like the definition of a really contested border, where militaries are used to guard the borders, not just define the borders. Is that pretty much what you're looking at?
Yes, but also the second part of my question was kind of like regarding ocean borders, because you'll have ocean borders, like with the South China Sea, and how China is, in a way, or already is, kind of breaking the law of the UN Convention, Law of the Seas. So in that context too.
Sorry, I didn't get the second part. So the UN Convention of the Laws of the Seas, UNCLOS, is actually what defines what nations can or cannot do. There are very clear guidelines of what is your exclusive economic zone, what is the space that you can use for your own purposes, and what is something called the global commons, like which is available for everybody. And you're right, that is exactly what China is doing when they are making these new islands. So what you are doing is, if you make a new island which is away from your economic zone, that really in effect extends your economic zone, and then you have the ability, if you were to actually extend that economic zone or your exclusive economic zone, then you were extending your boundaries. So I think the UN laws on the UNCLOS is very clear when it comes down to what are the demarcations of your boundaries when it comes to the seas. And this is where the rules-based international order is in contest with what I think nations like China are trying to interpret it to their benefit. And that's where the difference is. And that exactly ties into the part that I was talking about, the tension. The militarization of this space will start when the rules-based international order is challenged by great powers to say, no, we don't really agree to this. And if we have the following, let us say the first island chain or the second island chain, and everything that is there in this island chain belongs to this particular nation, that is where that particular contest will start. And that is where soldiers start coming in. That is where, according to your question, soldiers start guarding those borders. And when soldiers start guarding such borders, which are not really part of the rules-based international order, is where conflict happens.
Thank you so much. Sav, you're next.
Hi, thank you guys for coming in. It's a very neat opportunity to be able to speak with you guys one-on-one. I had a question for Lieutenant Colonel Greiner. Specifically, there was a point that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about Clausewitz. It was concerning decoupling strategy from political objective and ideals. And I wanted to know whether you had any thoughts on how Congress and the people could kind of help in the sense of political opinion and the people's opinion on separating those two.
Well, so thank you, Say. The premise of that point was actually not to decouple. That's where you'd have problems, but to ensure that they are well coupled and synchronized. And what we saw in Afghanistan was that decoupling, where the mission had shifted because we hadn't clearly defined what the political aim was going to be. And so in terms of if I misunderstood your question, I apologize, but I think in terms of ensuring this doesn't happen, right? Where can society be involved? Where can Congress be involved? It'd be, as I mentioned, the Weinberger Doctrine. It's the very first question that both had asked, right? And Weinberger, he had come up with this doctrine with the help of Powell after the Beirut barracks bombing, if you're familiar with that. And Powell himself had developed this doctrine over a lifetime of experiences, particularly in Vietnam. And the first question they posed was, what is the vital national interest, right? Is there a vital national interest? So the question that society has to ask, that Congress has to ask, is what is the interest? What is the intensity of that interest? Right? In terms of Afghanistan, it's hard to discern what that interest might be. Right? The response is understandable, right? We were attacked. We needed to now hold those who were culpable accountable and depose of the government that was providing safe haven to those individuals, right? So the response is understandable. The 20-year mission needs to have some foundation of a national interest, right? What is vital to this nation? And the way the public is involved with that is through a dialogue with Congress, through the ballot box. They have to have their voices heard. And if they can't identify the interest, if the public lose interest in that war, then that probably is an indication that there's a wanting of something vital, right, in that mission. Right? But the problem is, again, with AUMS authorizations for the use of military force, we don't have to have that dialogue. And when the American people can stay disassociated from the mission for want of foreign policy literacy or through the death draft and debt that I mentioned, right, then they're not holding those policymakers accountable, saying, clarify for us, what is our interest in being there? Why are we resourcing this war? And that's a transitive relationship, by the way, because when society holds policymakers accountable, policymakers are holding military leaders accountable.
Thank you so much. So are there more student questions? I don't see hands right now. Oh, yes, I do. Sam, let me.
Hi, how's it going? So my question has to do more of the in the cyber aspect of cyber espionage. So my question is, what are some of the most recent tactics or provisions that the U.S. government or the U.S. military, aside from sanctions, have taken to penalize these intrusions, such as those coming from China when they conduct these cyber intrusions or cyber espionage into our research and development companies or our U.S. government contractors? I don't know if there's any tactics or provisions that have been taken or laws passed to prevent such espionage from China. And maybe one of you guys know would love to answer that question. Thank you.
Yeah, I can start and then others can jump in if they want. There've been over the last, actually 15 years, there's been efforts to figure out how to deal with this. So when I started as a federal prosecutor, when we prosecuted cyber intrusion cases, and if they were coming from Russians or Chinese or North Koreans, we would build an investigation in secret, and then we would get a sealed indictment, and then we would try to find a way to be able to arrest the person. And so you'd use Interpol, and you'd use, see if they vacation in a place where we have an extradition treaty, or if we can trick them to come out of the country so we can grab them, and we keep it all secret. And so the State Department and the leaders of the Department of Justice in about 2012 decided that we need to do more because the attacks, as you described, were getting bigger, more sophisticated, and as particularly with China and to a lesser extent with Russia, we're targeting certain key defense industries and being used to help their industries. And so the State Department and the Department of Justice coordinated and started to stop making them secret and making them public. And so you could, and so they made a concerted effort, along with a report released by Mandiant that described exactly how China was, using its military to conduct cyber attacks. And so the first step they did, and they continue to do, is a diplomatic effort, really, which the Department of Justice has supplemented by indicting with a public indictable document that has clear descriptions that has been determined by a grand jury to have probable cause they committed the crime, to say it's real and this is really happening, because before that, China in particular was just denying anything happened. And so it made it much less likely that we'd actually prosecute the guys, because they knew if they ever left the country that they were in, that supported their attacks, that they would not, that we would be able to arrest them. And so, but that was an effort to push it, really public awareness. How effective that is up to you guys, but it was a step to do something. There have been some economic sanctions as well. There have been some efforts to target facilitators inside the United States who are providing the information. There's been some high profile prosecutions of them. There have been some abilities to try to track folks that are having, or do a better job in regulating labs and things inside the United States that are doing research that's important to national security. Those are the major things that we were doing. All of these acts are less military. There's also more coordination between the intelligence agencies and key national security industries like defense contractors, where if they're seeing certain type of cyber activity or targets against key defense industries, they're sharing information. That's non-public, but you've seen it. It's been talked about publicly in newspapers and things like that. But on a case-to-case basis, if they're sharing information to let people know so they can harden the defense industry. And the defense industry is doing their part to make them more difficult for them to be hacked. So that's really, what I've seen from my background as prosecutor and law enforcement, but there are others too.
Thank you so much. We have time for maybe one more question if there are more student questions.
I can say, Sam had some comments on the chat, and that there are all kinds of crimes under federal criminal law. He mentioned Title 18, which is where most of them are, but there are in other spots to all kinds of different types of cyber attacks or cyber intrusion and espionage. The UCMJ has some too, but the UCMJ applies to those in uniform and under rare occasions to the enemy if they commit war crimes. So, but federal prosecutors have broad jurisdiction, and state prosecutors have many statutes to prosecute a host of cyber attacks.
Thank you. There's so much to potentially follow up on all of this stuff, all of these issues. So let me give one last chance to students. This is your last chance to ask a question. Dr. Bose, did you want to, oh, Sam, I'm sorry, maybe Sam has a follow-up.
I'll defer to Sam.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bose.
Thank you. Yeah. So I know you mentioned some of the tactics we have to prevent foreign cyber espionage, but if we have a foreign national here in the U.S. conducting foreign cyber espionage, and through CI investigations and court trials and applying U.S. Title 18 codes, that individual is found guilty, what happens once that sentence is over? Are they then transferred back to their home country, or are they still detained here in some form or aspect? That's my last question. Thank you.
Good question. So if they're not a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, just like every other defendant we prosecute at the termination of their sentence, then they're released and they're turned over usually to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, who deports them. So espionage has some other quirky things, because sometimes there can be a diplomatic effort to trade before their sentence expires, to trade their spies for our spies that the other side captured. But that's the exception, not the rule. Generally, the rule is it's just, if you commit a crime, you're prosecuted. If you're convicted, you serve your time. And then if you don't have a lawful right to be in the United States, you're deported.
Dr. Fritz, I was going to ask a question about public opinion as someone who studies American politics, but I think that's a question for another panel, because we've raised so many important topics here about trade, cybersecurity, and military intervention. And I think the clear message, I think, across maybe what unifies all of the topics from our speakers today is the importance of an informed public and an engaged public in foreign policy. How we get there, I think, is another, maybe that's the topic for our follow-up panel. But I'll turn it back to you and just say that, take the moment just to thank our panelists for a highly instructive discussion that will inform our class conversations going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bose. You summarized that so nicely in so many ways. So I just, I have so many more questions I'd love to ask, but you've all been so generous already. So I thank you so much for your time, for your expertise. General Talwar, Colonel Walsh, Colonel Greiner, Colonel Hutton, thank you all for doing this. I touched on so many different important aspects to this, and I hope we can continue to do this, because I just want to second what Dr. Bose said about engagement, citizens engagement, student engagement, thinking critically about these issues. So I welcome you back to Hofstra anytime you want. Just let me know. And as Dr. Bose said earlier, please, hopefully we can do it in person sometime too. So thank you again for everything.
It was really our pleasure. We cherish these opportunities, and we do thank you for your generosity in hosting us and giving us the opportunity to speak with your students, with you and your students. Thank you so much.
Thank you.